At 4:01 in the morning on November 5, 1983, a diving bell locked onto the deck chamber system of the Byford Dolphin in the Norwegian North Sea. Inside, 4 saturation divers were living at 9 atmospheres, the same pressure their bodies would feel at roughly 90 meters underwater. 2 of them had just returned from a dive. 2 were asleep. Outside the chambers, 2 tenders were working the clamp that connected the bell to the living quarters. 12 minutes later, 5 men were dead. What happened to those 5 men and why is one of the most precisely documented industrial disasters in offshore history, and one whose official explanation was fought over for decades. The forensic record produced in the aftermath is unlike anything else in the literature on pressure-related injuries, and the fight over what the equipment had allowed to happen would continue for nearly 25 years. The accident only makes sense if you understand the world these men worked inside. And at the heart of that world was one physical fact: pressure. When a diver breathes compressed gas underwater, the inert component of that gas, the part the body doesn't consume, dissolves into the blood and tissues under pressure. When the diver ascends, that dissolved gas has to come back out. If it comes out too fast, it forms bubbles in the bloodstream and joints. Decompression sickness, known as the bends. The deeper the dive, the more gas dissolves, and the longer the ascent has to be. For decades, that was the wall divers kept running into. You could only go so deep, stay so long, and work so much before the decompression schedule made the whole operation impractical. A Navy physician named George Bond began to challenge that in the late 1950s. Bond was stationed at the Naval Submarine Medical Research Laboratory in New London, Connecticut. His proposal was this: the relationship between time at depth and required decompression time was not actually linear. Once the body's tissues had absorbed as much dissolved gas as they could hold at a given pressure, once they were fully saturated, decompression requirements stopped increasing. A diver who spent 1 hour at 300 feet needed the same ascent schedule as one who spent 24 hours there. Bond ran his first experiments on animals in 1957 and 1958. By 1962, human subjects were being saturated in controlled laboratory trials. The United States Navy then built a series of experimental underwater habitats: Sea Lab 1 in 1964, Sea Lab 2 in 1965, Sea Lab 3 in 1969, when a diver named Barry Cannon died. Vicious phase. Then the oil industry saw what this could mean. If a diver could live at pressure for days or weeks and pay the decompression cost only once, a saturation diving team could maintain a near-continuous working presence at depth. For offshore oil and gas development, that was invaluable. By the time Bond's research reached the commercial sector, the North Sea oil boom was already underway. The price shocks of the 1970s made the gas and oil reserves beneath the North Sea extraordinarily valuable almost overnight. Norway and the United Kingdom built entire industries around extracting them. Subsea wellheads, pipelines across the ocean floor, and infrastructure that had to be installed and maintained at depths beyond the reach of ordinary diving. And the people sent into that new frontier were saturation divers. At its peak, saturation diving in the North Sea was one of the highest-paying jobs in the offshore industry. It was also one of the most dangerous jobs in offshore oil. The men who did it lived for weeks at a time inside pressurized steel chambers on drilling rigs and support vessels held at pressures matching their working depth. At 90 meters, that was 9 times the pressure of the atmosphere at sea level. The divers breathed a carefully managed mixture of helium and oxygen, heliox, rather than compressed air. At those pressures, ordinary air becomes dangerous. Nitrogen can become narcotic, and oxygen levels have to be carefully controlled. Heliox solved both problems and kept the divers clear-headed. It also gave their voices the distinctive high-pitched quality that anyone who has heard a saturation diver speak through an intercom will recognize. Each working shift, a subset of the diving team transferred from those living chambers into a diving bell. a pressurized capsule lowered on a cable to the seabed. The bell locked onto the deck chamber system through a connection point on the rig hull, a series of trunks and clamps designed to maintain pressure throughout. At the seabed, the divers left the bell through a hatch, completed their work, then returned and rowed back up to the rig. Back at the surface, they transferred through the connecting passages into the living chambers. They did not decompress between shifts. At those depths, a proper decompression took days, so the divers stayed at pressure for the duration of their tour, sometimes 28 days, sleeping, eating, watching television, playing cards, all inside a chamber roughly the size of a large van. Nobody could honestly say the danger was a surprise. Roughly 30 divers had died in the North Sea basin by 1983. Regulatory oversight in the Norwegian sector sat with the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate, the NPD, but critics, including the divers themselves, described it as hands-off and deferential to industry. Diving companies used proprietary decompression tables and kept them confidential as a competitive measure. Divers were sometimes pressured to work shifts that exceeded the maximum permitted hours. And on many older systems, equipment had not been updated to reflect newer safety rules, because those rules were not retroactive. The Byford Dolphin was a semi-submersible column-stabilized drilling rig of the Aker H3 design, built at Aker Verdal in Norway and completed in February of 1974. Originally named Deep Sea Driller, it was 108 meters long and 67 meters wide, capable of drilling to 6,000 meters. By November of 1983, it had been chartered by the French oil company Elf Aquitaine and was stationed on the Northeast Frigg field in the Norwegian North Sea, approximately 230 kilometers northwest of Stavanger. The diving contractor operating the saturation system on board was Comex Norge, a Norwegian arm of the French company Comex. The diving system dated from 1975. It consisted of two deck decompression chambers, Chamber 1 and Chamber 2, connected to a diving bell through a series of short cylindrical passageways called trunks. The bell locked onto the deck system via a clamp, a mechanical coupling that sealed the bell trunk against the chamber trunk when the two were joined. The procedure for ending a bell dive was clearly defined. Once the bell was recovered and latched to the deck, and once the divers had transferred back through the trunks into the chambers, the correct sequence was: close the bell door, increase bell pressure slightly to ensure a firm seal, close the inner chamber door, slowly depressurize the trunk to 1 atmosphere, and only then open the clamp. And on the Byford Dolphin, one missing piece of equipment mattered more than anything else. There was no interlock. Nothing in the design of that 1975 system physically prevented the clamp from being opened while the trunk was still pressurized. Det Norske Veritas, the classification body that certified the rig, had published rules in 1982 specifying that connecting mechanisms between emblem chambers should be arranged so they could not be operated under pressure. But those rules applied to new systems only. The Byford Dolphin's 1975 system was not required to be updated. Comex had applied for and received formal dispensations from the NPD, permitting the system to operate without the interlock, without outboard pressure gauges, and without the communications hardware that the newer rules required. On the night of November 4th into the morning of November 5th, 4 divers were working in and around that system. Edwin Arthur Coward was 35 years old. He was British, experienced, and had completed a shift earlier that night. He was resting in Chamber 2. Roy P. Lucas was 38, also British, the father of 3 children. He was also in Chamber 2, asleep. Bjorn Giver Bergersen was 29, Norwegian, and had just returned from a bell dive to the subsea template on the Northeast Frigg field. Truls Hellevik was 34, also Norwegian, and had made the same dive with Bergersen. The 2 dive tenders responsible for managing the exterior of the system that night were William Crammond, 32 years old and British, and a man named Martin Saunders. By the time the bell reached the surface and connected to the deck, the two tenders had been on duty for approximately 12 hours and 48 minutes. The Norwegian Petroleum Museum's reconstruction of the accident, drawing on the official inquiry, places the sequence of events as follows. At approximately 4:01 in the morning, the bell locked onto the chamber system. A diver on deck confirmed the locking mechanism was in place. The door between the trunk and chamber 1 was opened. Bergersen and Hellevik began moving equipment through into the living quarters. The system was holding at 9 atmospheres, the pressure corresponding to their working depth. At around 4:08, both divers had completed the transfer. The diving supervisor increased bell pressure slightly to create a firm seal on the bell door. The next step in the sequence was for Truls Hellevik to close the inner chamber door, the door separating the trunk from chamber 1, before the trunk could be slowly depressurized and the clamp opened. At 4:13, Hellevik had not yet closed that door when the clamp was opened. The pressure of 9 atmospheres in the chamber system met the exterior atmosphere of 1 atmosphere at the deck of the rig. The trunk, the bell, and everything connected to them blew outward. The diving bell was blasted off its seat and thrown across the deck. William Crammond, who had been at the clamp, was struck by it. He died before reaching the hospital. Martin Saunders was also struck. He sustained collapsed lungs, spinal fractures, and multiple other injuries. He survived. Inside the chambers, Edwin Coward, Roy Lucas, and Bjorn Bergersen were killed almost instantaneously. Truls Hellevik, positioned closest to the clamp and the trunk opening, was forced through the crescent-shaped gap that formed when the inner door swung too far under the pressure blast and lodged ajar. The gap was approximately 60 centimeters across. Because William Crammond died in the accident, investigators were never able to determine with certainty whether he opened the clamp on his own initiative, on a miscommunicated instruction from the diving supervisor, or under some other misapprehension of where the sequence stood. That question has never been resolved. A forensic examination of the 4 divers was carried out in the days following the accident. The findings were published in 1988 in the American Journal of Forensic Medicine and Pathology by 6 Norwegian pathologists: J.C. Gjertsen, E. Sandstad, I. Morild, G. Bang, A.J. Bursand, and S. Eidsvik. Their paper, titled An Explosive Decompression Accident, is the primary clinical record of what happened inside those chambers. When the 4 divers breathed their heliox mixture at 9 atmospheres over the course of their time at pressure, the helium dissolved into their blood and tissues at roughly 9 times the concentration it would carry at sea level. Under controlled conditions, this is entirely manageable. The slow, staged ascent of a planned decompression allows the dissolved gas to come back out through the lungs gradually over days. On the morning of November 5th, the ambient pressure dropped from 9 atmospheres to 1 in fractions of a second. The 3 divers inside the chambers, Coward, Lucas, and Bergersen, died, the pathologists wrote, on the spot, probably instantaneously. The most striking finding in all 3 cases was the presence of large quantities of free fat in the cardiac chambers, the great vessels, and throughout the smaller vessels of both the cystic and the pulmonary circulation. The authors described its appearance as resembling butter dropped into a hot pan. What they found was not the fat embolism seen in trauma patients, where fat is displaced by a physical injury into the bloodstream from elsewhere in the body. This was something different. The pressure drop was so rapid that dissolved gas came out of solution everywhere in the body simultaneously, an effect often described as the blood boiling, though heat had nothing to do with it. The disruption was mechanical and chemical. The erupting gas broke apart the lipoprotein complexes in the blood that normally keep fats soluble, causing the fats to fall out of solution in place throughout the entire circulatory system at once. The pathologists proposed a specific new term for this finding: fat precipitation rather than fat embolism, to separate explosive decompression from conventional trauma. The organs showed gas throughout the blood vessels. The lungs were swollen, with hemorrhages beneath the surface and gas-filled blisters. The brains were pale, with gas-filled vessels and cystic bubbles throughout the tissue. No alcohol or drugs were found in any of the men. Popular accounts of this accident frequently attribute what happened to nitrogen. The chamber atmosphere in saturation diving is predominantly helium. The pathologists refer to dissolved gas generally. What happened to Truls Hellevik is in the same paper. The inner trunk door, blasted by the pressure wave, swung too far and lodged ajar, leaving the crescent-shaped gap. The paper records the bisection of the thoraco-abdominal cavity, the expulsion of the thoracic and abdominal organs, and portions of the remains found on the rig's derrick, 10 meters above the chamber level. The pathologists attributed the injuries to the combined effects of the pressure differential and extreme physical force. A commission was appointed by the Norwegian Minister of Local Government and Labor on November 7, 1983, 2 days after the accident. It reported on the 22nd of February, 1984, as Norwegian Official Report NOU 1984:11. The Commission's conclusion on the direct cause was a failure in routines. The locking device had been unlatched while the system was still under pressure and before the internal doors were closed. The Commission described this as human error, but buried inside that same report was a much uglier picture. Between August 15th and November 5th of 1983, the 82 days before the accident, 38% of Bell excursions on the Byford Dolphin had exceeded the maximum permitted 8 hours. No shift plan had been in place during the relevant period. No log of the divers' working hours had been kept. The two tenders on duty at the time of the accident had been working for 12 hours and 48 minutes. The Commission documented these failures and did not use them to challenge its central finding, and it applied no comparable scrutiny to the equipment. The missing safeguards, the interlock, the pressure gauges, the communications hardware were not accidental gaps. They were the result of formal dispensations the NPD had granted. The same body that held supervisory responsibility over diving safety in the Norwegian sector had authorized the equipment to remain non-compliant. It was now the body responsible for investigating the consequences. 1 month after the accident, the interlock requirement was made mandatory for all Bell systems in Norwegian waters. That single change would likely have made this exact accident impossible. In the months and years that followed, the families of the 5 men began receiving information that sat poorly alongside the official findings. William Crammond's widow, Ruth, was told in the aftermath that her husband had tampered with the gauges. She believed it. She moved away from the community in Scotland where she had lived. She said later, because she felt the weight of it, that Bill had done something wrong and 4 other men had died because of it. I felt ashamed, she said. I felt that people were crossing the road so they didn't have to talk to me. She carried that for roughly 25 years. Roy Lucas had left behind a daughter named Claire and a son named Stephen. Claire grew up knowing her father had died on a rig in the North Sea and that the official account said someone had failed to follow a procedure. He did not accept it. I would go so far as to say that the Norwegian government murdered my father, she said, because they knew that they were diving with an unsafe decompression chamber. Her brother Stephen was direct. We've never even received an apology, and that's disgusting. The group that kept pushing when everyone else wanted the case closed was the North Sea Divers Alliance, Nordsjødykker Alliansen in Norwegian, formed in the early 1990s by pioneer divers and victims' relatives. Their argument was straightforward. The Commission's human error verdict had deflected attention from the equipment and from the regulatory body that had authorized it. To acknowledge the absent interlock as the central cause was to acknowledge that the NPD had sanctioned an unsafe system, a finding it was not positioned to make about itself. In February of 2008, the North Sea Divers Alliance obtained a report confirming that the absence of the interlock was the primary cause of the accident. It had taken 24 years. Ruth Crammond, speaking around that time, said, "Just 6 weeks ago, I found out that if a certain bit of equipment had been installed, the accident would never have happened. All I am looking for is an apology and the truth to come out and clear Bill. She never received an apology. In 1986, criminal fines were imposed on a senior executive of Comex and a senior executive of Elf Aquitaine. The charge against the Elf executive was later dropped. Fines were imposed, but no one was imprisoned, and no full criminal reckoning followed. In the United Kingdom, Edwin Coward's widow sued the contractor. Comex Holder Diving Limited admitted liability from the outset. The Queen's Bench Division awarded £165,800 in 1987. Both sides appealed the damages calculation, and the Court of Appeal revised the figures the following year. The Norwegian state denied legal responsibility for more than 2 decades. In 2009, Norway's Supreme Court ruled in the state's favor on the legal question. The government nonetheless agreed to compensate the families, characterizing the payments as recognition of a moral and political duty. Claire Lucas received just over £100,000. Her siblings received comparable amounts. A group of North Sea saturation divers brought a separate case before the European Court of Human Rights, Vilnius and others versus Norway, arguing that Norway had violated their right to a private life under Article 8 of the European Convention by withholding health information, including the secret proprietary decompression tables the diving companies had been permitted to keep confidential. On December 5, 2013, the court ruled 5-2 in the divers' favor. Each was awarded €8,000 in non-pecuniary damages. By 2015, the Norwegian government had paid a total of €1,925,207 to 250 divers and the families of deceased divers under a broader compensation arrangement, also structured as a moral and political settlement, not a legal admission. No one at Comex, at ELF, or within the NPD was ever held criminally accountable. Byford Dolphin forced a specific technical change. It did not trigger the kind of sweeping North Sea safety overhaul that would come after Piper Alpha. The Piper Alpha disaster of July 6, 1988 killed 167 men on an Occidental production platform in the British sector after a gas condensate leak ignited and triggered a cascading series of explosions. Lord Cullen's public inquiry produced 106 recommendations and led to the Offshore Installations Safety Case Regulations of 1992, which required operators for the first time to formally demonstrate in writing that they had identified and managed their risks. Regulatory oversight transferred from the Department of Energy, which faced its own conflict of interest as both promoter and regulator of the North Sea industry, to the Health and Safety Executive. The Byford Dolphin sits within a list of offshore disasters that preceded Piper Alpha and went inadequately addressed. The Seagem rig collapsed in 1965, killing 13 men. The Alexander L. Keeland flotel capsized in 1980, with 123 dead. Between 1966 and 2016, 82 diving personnel died in the North Sea basin, more than half of them before the end of 1979. The Byford Dolphin remains the single largest loss of life in the history of offshore saturation diving. After the accident, after the inquiry, after the fines and the suits and the compensation, paid without any admission of legal wrongdoing, the rig returned to work. It continued operating in the North Sea for years. If you made it this far, thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one.